Uh, Hello, welcome back to the continuing lecture in financial statements. This is Dr. Jeff Hong, and this is uh, the third video, I believe, in the intro in the financial statements. Um, so we started on the structure of income statement in our last video, and so to recap what we talked about last time, there is the structure of income statement, of course, starts with the income, right? And I said, actually, income statement is short for income and expenses statement. So when we have income, all the sources of income listed, then we'll need to go over expenses. And first of all, I said the primary source of income is the sales revenue, right? And we defined sales revenue as price times quantity sold. Price times quantity, right? Price times quantity sold. Again, there is no better definition than mathematical definition, because there is no room for any open interpretation, right? It's clearly defined and close-ended. So it cannot, once you define it this way, it's infallible and it's indisputable, right? And the secondary source of income is investment income. Investment income. Now, as for the expenses, I said there are two sources of expenses. The first one is the direct expense or direct cost. Second source is indirect cost. Indirect cost. And direct cost is also called the CGS, cost of goods sold. Which is a accounting terminology, and it's also called total variable cost, which is microeconomics terminology. And I said variable cost. The variable means literally the cost varies with this cost varies with the output level, right? And I'll get back to that. Indirect cost is also called OPEX, right? Operating expenses. And which is also called total fixed cost, which is microeconomics terminology for that. And I should also rewrite it. I mean, this was, it's not exactly equal sign. It's like approximately equal. OPEX, operating expenses, is approximately equal to total fixed cost. Now, so if you, now it's time to think about, understand what CGS is. It means cost of goods sold. So the cost we are talking about is the direct cost. And what is the direct cost? The cost that cost of direct inputs of production, right? We discussed it in the last video. And the direct inputs of production or factors of production are very well defined by microeconomics. It's capital, labor, and raw material or natural resource, right? And we assumed, Dell computer, right? And we assumed, Model X, uh, Dell computers Model X, uh, um, the direct cost, a direct input cost of, in other words, the cost of capital, labor, and raw material are altogether $300. Okay. Um, so, uh, but of course, they when they sell it, it's not they're not going to sell it for $300. Let's say they are selling it for $500. Okay, so $500 is the uh, price. So if they sell 0 units, then their revenue is 0. If they sell 1 unit, the revenue is 500. If they sell 10 units, 5,000. If they sell 100 units, 50,000, and so on, right? If they sell 1,000, $500,000, right? Now, per unit, basically, price is a per unit concept, right? Price is a per unit concept. CGS is not a per unit concept. It is an aggregate concept. In other words, cost of goods sold. Goods is already in plural. So if you sold, uh, 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 10 units, it's $3,000. If you sold 100 units, it's $30,000. In other words, the direct cost of the quantity sold, right? That's what is meant by cost of goods sold. And then, because $300 is the cost side of the revenue, right? Makes sense? $300 is the cost side of the price. Now, but then it is also so per unit production cost. Actually, $300 is the per unit production cost. Per unit production cost. Okay, makes sense. Now, it is also called the total variable cost in microeconomics. And why is it called that way? Now, variable means something is varying, right? Changing. So what is varying? It sounds like the cost is, no, cost is $300. What is varying? Output level, right? Output level is changing. In other words, what is the uh, total variable cost when you produced 0 unit? If you produce 0 unit, total variable cost is 0. If you produce 1 unit, total variable cost is 300. If you produced, 100 units, 10 units, total variable cost is 1,000. Produce 10,000 units, 100 units, total variable cost is 30,000, and so on. 1,000 units, you produced 1,000 units, total variable cost is 300,000. So in other words, total variable cost is per unit production cost per unit times quantity produced. So this can be rewritten as, total variable cost can be rewritten as also average variable cost times quantity. Average variable cost times quantity. Okay, average. So what is average variable cost? Production cost per unit is average variable cost. Isn't that right? What is average? Average is basically total divided by quantity. Isn't that right? Because if the total direct cost or total variable cost is 300,000, if you divide it by quantity, 1,000, gives you exactly 300, right? Which is, production cost per unit. But you divide it total by quantity, so that's average, right? And then average times quantity is total. So 300 times 1,000 units, 300,000, right? $300,000. So think about it. Anyway, in this case, we are dealing with industrial product. In other words, computer is a standardized product. Isn't that right? Computer is, the same model. Let's not assume any variant, right? But just the same model, Model X. It cannot be different. It cannot be, there's no reason for the price to be different from one unit to another. Of course, eventually the price will have, after reaching the uh, uh, maximum point, then the price will have to come down. Now, let's think about it. Price cannot be maintained at the same level forever because, um, uh, first of all, because of demand and supply. When the market is saturated, right, up to a certain point, you can sell. You can sell the product at a some given target price, but once it reaches once it reaches the market saturation point, I mean everyone who wants to have it and who can afford to have it all have it. Everyone has it. Then the price has to come down to push sale, right? Um, that's the case of price. In case of average cost, right? Uh, product average cost is relatively constant up to a certain point. I mean, average production cost would also have to uh, uh, actually, it would increase after a certain point, and because in microeconomics the marginal cost will drastically increase after a certain point, but the manufacturers generally maintain the production level within the constant uh, average cost range, right? So it's pretty much steady, constant number. I mean, cost cannot cost of a standardized product cannot vary from one unit to another. So it's basically uh, everything is average, right? Cost is the per unit production cost is exactly the average. Now, So we understand that what direct cost is and what is indirect cost. Indirect cost is the cost that is, not directly related to production, right? This cost is not directly related to production. So if it is not directly related to production, what kind of cost is not directly related to production? Well, to give you an example, uh, operating expenses are uh, a very good example of operating expenses is uh, rent, right? Suppose you are renting an office space, and it is a fixed cost in a sense because rent doesn't increase or decrease with the production level. In other words, if you're renting an office space, um, just because in a particular month your revenue is great, excellent, right? Uh, your revenue doubled in a particular month. Does that mean you have to pay double the rent? No, you don't pay double the rent. You pay the same rent, regardless of your revenue, right? And in a particular month, you had your business was very bad. Your revenue was not even half uh, the average month, revenue of the average month. Then does that mean you can pay half the rent? Of course, you don't. That's not possible, right? So, in other words, regardless of your revenue, right? Uh, or regardless, revenue depends on what? Of course, it's output level. Revenue depends on output level, isn't it right? If your output, if you produce more, if your production level is greater, and the revenue would generally be greater because you have a bigger sale, right? So unlike the direct cost, which directly changes with the production level, indirect cost doesn't change with the production level. And rent is a very good example of that. And the second example is um, uh, the clerical staff. Now let's think about it. When you double the production, right? When you say workers or employees, you think they are all the same. No, they're not all the same. There are two types of workers, two types of employees, right? One, and especially this is a manufacturing business, and we assumed computer manufacturing like Dell. Now, in a manufacturing, there are clearly two types of employees. One is uh, the production workers, right? Production workers. In other words, the workers that are directly uh, involved in production process. So the workers that are working on the assembly line, workers that are directly involved in production activity. And there are a different type of workers, uh, clerical staff. In other words, a secretary is a very good example of clerical staff, right? And they are not directly involved in production activity, production process. So suppose uh, the company increases the production by double. In other words, the company doubles the production level. Company, the business is so good they want to double the production. Then what do you need to do? Everything, all the inputs will double, isn't that right? All the inputs of production will double. In other words, labor will double, raw material will have to double, capital usage will double, right? And in terms of labor, doubling the labor, there are two ways. In other words, you can hire twice as many workers, twice as many, right? Uh, Literally doubling the number of production workers. Or you can keep the same number of production workers and just double their hours, double their working hours, right? Of course, in reality, people cannot, it's not humanly possible to consistently put the workers on double time, right? Um, if you work 8 hours a day, uh, for a couple of days, you may work, 16 hours a day, but you cannot keep doing this forever. So in reality, of course, it's some kind of, some combination of, doubling the number or increasing the number of workers or increasing their hours. But this is only limited to, this is, limited to production workers, right? Now, think about the clerical staff, a secretary. When you increase, when you double the production, right? When you double the output level, does that mean you have to double the number of secretaries or double the secretary hours? Hmm? No, absolutely not. Why? Because although secretaries may work, their hours may increase a little. If they normally work 8 hours, and if the company is, churning out twice as much output as before, then secretaries may put in a few more hours. But it's not like, you need to double the number of secretaries or double their hours, right? Certainly, they will get busier than before when, output is doubled and sales double, right? But certainly, their, uh, their numbers, or in other words, if their numbers or hours don't double, then uh, it doesn't double with, in other words, with the production level. So it is constant. In other words, it doesn't change with the production level. Okay, hence called fixed cost. Okay, but operating expenses and total fixed cost are not exactly the same concept, because in microeconomics, total fixed cost uh, uh, includes more of the sunk cost concept. Okay, I will come back to sunk cost, but for now, you can understand it simply as initial investment. Okay, now, so suppose, we assume the direct cost was $300 per unit. Let's assume indirect cost is $100 per unit. Then what comes next? Suppose their investment income, let's ignore this. Their investment income is zero. Sales revenue is, the revenue price is $500. So when you have income and expenses all listed, then what do you need to do? You will need to subtract the expenses from income. And if you subtract, suppose the quantity is 1,000, right? 1,000, P is 1,000. If quantity is 1,000, revenue will be $500,000. Revenue will be 500,000. And total variable cost will be 300,000. Total fixed operating expenses will be 100,000. So if you subtract this from this, right? And we know what you will get. You will get about 100,000. And what is that called? Oh, that's, roughly, it's called profit. But this is not profit. It's too early to call it profit. It's called, there's another name, operating income, or, right? Operating income or operating profit. Okay, so it's either called operating income or operating profit. Okay. So from operating income, we have to get to a final, the final point. The finish line is not operating income. Finish line is the net income. But to get to the net income, we still need to go through a couple of things, right? So actually, so the next step, next thing we have to go through is the interest expense. Subtracting interest expense. You might wonder, what interest? Well, remember, if this company raised capital through sale of bonds, right? Right? The company raised, a capital to acquire physical capital, right? Like, plant and equipment, right? And it needed startup capital, so they, borrowed money. And then there is interest to pay, right? So that's the interest expense. You'll have to subtract the interest expense first, right? And then you'll have to subtract taxes. Minus taxes, right? And then you can arrive at net income or net profit. Net income or net profit. Okay. But then we have to, there are so many names, right? In other words, they don't go by just one name. Another name for operating income is also called EBIT. Okay. And what does EBIT stand for? EBIT stands for earnings before interest and taxes, right? We're gonna, time is up, so we'll have to come back to this, but let me keep going just a little more, because it's not the right timing to cut off here. Earnings before interest and taxes is already quite self-explanatory, isn't it, right? Or is self-predicting? I mean, is self simply, you can analyze the word, you can analyze the terminology, and it already, and by you can tell that the term already is, predicating what it's gonna do, what comes next, isn't that right? It's predicating what comes next. It's earnings before interest and taxes. So what comes next? Interest comes next, and then comes taxes. That's why it says it's called earnings before interest and taxes, right? And then you can also come to the realization that the term earnings is another name for profit. Isn't that right? It's another name for profit. Okay? So then Think about it. Once you subtract from EBIT, you subtract interest, then what do you think it should be called? It should be called then earnings before taxes, EBT, earnings before taxes, right? And once you have paid taxes, then what should it be called? In other words, before paying taxes is called earnings before taxes, right? And there's a counterpart terminology here. There's a counterpart term here in the left-hand side, but I didn't write it. But after paying taxes, of course, that's net income or net profit, but you have paid taxes already. So it should be called what? It's called EAT, earnings after taxes. Okay, earnings after taxes. So just by following this, by following this column, the logic in this column, right, the right-hand side column, right, it already gives you a lot of insight, right? Well, so time's up. So I'll come back to this in the next video. Okay, thank you for watching, and this is the end of the recording here.